So thank you very much for this introduction and welcome. At the first, I will bother you a little bit about Fromm's development of Fromm's social psychological theory because I want to put some emphasis on special topics which usually are not so much concerned of, overlooked more. Okay, and in regard to my manuscript, I will skip some paragraphs also in the beginning. Fromm's decisive scientific contribution can be seen in the fact that Fromm can not only explain how the uniqueness of each human being manifests itself in psychic structural formations, which then lead to a particular thinking, feeling, and acting in this individual, but he can also explain how society is represented in the individual with their own psychic structure formation, what Fromm called social character. This social character is a reason that a multitude of individuals display similar patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting, and that all tend to strive for what a particular society needs for its existence and functioning. The uniform will and striving of the many, made possible by the social character formation, thus psychologically forms the cement of a given society. With a theory of social character formation in every individual, Fromm postulates a psychological representation of the requirements of social coexistence in the individual, which is an expression of the primary sociality of the human being. The social character allows the mental impulses of a society to be explored in detail. With the concept of social character, Fromm does justice to the interaction of cognitive, emotional, and socio-economic conditions and show that every transformation of human behavior requires a change in social character. Let us ask a bit more precisely how Fromm arrived at such a social psychoanalytic approach. Two questions can be recognized that preoccupied Fromm throughout his life. The first question is what makes many people think, feel, and act similarly. He already pursued this question in his dissertation from 1922. Fromm asked, what makes Jewish people who lived in the diaspora, that is without protection and external support of binational and state institutions, what makes these people think, feel, and act similarly? Fromm identified the shared religious ethos as the reason for similar thinking, feeling, and acting. The basic idea that a certain life practice, as Fromm called this, leads to internal strivings and behavior patterns already defined Fromm's thinking at a time when he did not yet know Freud's psychoanalysis, and long before he came into contact with the ideas of the Frankfurt School. Therefore, anyone researches Fromm's social psychology must start with his 1922 dissertation, and not only in the Frankfurt School. And this dissertation, since 2 years, is also available in English translation. Fromm's acquaintance with Freud's psychoanalysis later led to a first paradigm shift. The internalized ethos forms are now to be understood as psychic impulses, although these must not be blindly believed, according to Freud. The possibility that irrational and dysfunctional strivings also determine human thought, feeling, and action, even without the individual being aware of these impulses, was the long-sought answer to another question that dominated Fromm's thinking, scientific thinking, throughout his life. Namely the question, how is irrational behavior possible? The adolescent Fromm asked, why does a woman commit suicide and want to be buried at the site of her recently deceased father? Or why did the Germans go to a deadly war in 1914 with such enthusiasm? What unconscious forces are at work here, and how do they develop? The answer Freud gave with his drive theories impressed Fromm, mainly because the repression of libidinal desires, drivings, and fantasies is not out of the world, but occurs or recurs in disguised form in irrational, inhibited, self-harming strivings and behavior patterns. Freud's explanation that such impulses derive their drive energy from innate drives that seek satisfaction and in doing so come into conflict with the demand of society and culture, so that they must be repressed, was inconsistent with Fromm's idea that a particular practice of life leads to internalized strivings. But this was not to become a problem for Fromm until the mid-1930s. At the end of the 1920s, Fromm's fascination with Freudian theory led him ask what possibility existed for psychoanalytically investigating the thoughts, feelings, and actions of many people in order to be able to explain irrational reactions and behavior patterns of social groupings. Others at the Berlin Institute, where Fromm completed his training as a psychoanalyst, also pursued this question. For example, Siegfried Bernfeld, Wilhelm Reich, and not to overlook Theodor Reich, who in his treatise Dogma and Zwangsidee simply transferred neurotic phenomena in the individual to group phenomena and thus explained the behavior of the many. The most important work for the development of Fromm's social psychology is not the famous 1932 essay in the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, but the 1930 essay entitled The Dogma of Christ. It appears in the same journal, Imago, in which Reich had published his essay. Fromm, who studied sociology, wanted to show that the psychoanalytic method used for social phenomena must differ from that used for explaining irrational phenomena in the individual. This is why he also critically dealt with Reich at the end of this study, The Dogma of Christ. While Reich concludes the compulsive character of religion from the compulsory ritual performance of an individual, Fromm starts from the concrete practice, life practice of the many Christians, and shows historically in detail that the changes in the confession formulations about Jesus as Son of Man, as Christ, as Redeemer, as Son of God, and so on, that these are always based on political and social changes of the people professing to be Christians. Fromm concluded from this that there must be a libidinous structure formation in each individual that represents the social life practice. Fromm then elaborated his social psychological theory in 1932, still using Freud's libido theory to explain the structure formation. The task of social psychology is to explain the shared socially relevant psychic attitudes and ideologies and their unconscious roots in particular, in terms of the influence of economic conditions on libido strivings. However, it did not take long for Fromm to realize that his social psychoanalytic approach could not fully reconciled with the libido theory favored by Freud to explain conscious and unconscious psychic strivings. There was a whole series of findings that made Fromm doubt the validity of the libido theory. For example, Bachhofen's research in matricentric cultures, or Margaret Mead's and Ruth Benedict's cross-cultural studies. They fed Fromm's critique of patriarchal aspects of Freud's psychoanalysis and therapeutic practice. The decisive impetus to recast his own social psychoanalytic approach after emigration in 1934 undoubtedly came from conversations with Harry Stack Sullivan, who fundamentally questions Freud's libido theory. The very fact that the most serious mental illnesses are psychotic distortions of relatedness to reality, to other people, and to oneself, suggests that the question of relatedness is a basic psychic problem of the human being, and not that of the satisfaction or denial of the sexual drive and its derivatives. In the winter of 1936 and 1937, Fromm took time out to make another paradigm shift, this time from the libido theoretical to a relational theoretical explanatory framework. In a letter, Fromm wrote, "I am trying to show that the drives that motivate social actions are not, as Freud assumes, sublimations of the sexual instincts, but products of the social processes." Fromm summarizes the conclusions in 1941 in the appendix of his book Escape from Freedom. The crucial point is that for Fromm, psychological phenomena are largely the result of internalized relational experiences, partly personal, partly social. The new approach also leads to a different understanding of the relationship between the individual and society. We believe that man is primarily a social being, and not, as Freud assumes, primarily self-sufficient and only secondarily in need of others in order to satisfy his instinctual needs. According to Fromm, the primary sociality of humans finds its expression in a separate dimension of psychic structure formation, the socially, as he called it in this paper of 1936, the socially typical character, or as he said later, the social character, as well as in the fact that there is also a social consciousness and a social repression. Fromm's social psychoanalysis assigns an equally important role to economic, social, and cultural factors in the formation of psychic impulse structures, if not more so than to the very personal attachment experiences that manifest themselves as impulses in individual character formations. According to Fromm's social psychoanalytic theory, with every individual, society is always lying on the couch too. The concept of social character tries to do justice to the interaction between socio-economic life practice and psychic impulses, because only when this interaction is taken into account in transformation processes will socially relevant changes actually occur. Therefore, anyone exploring questions of transformation with Fromm in mind cannot avoid dealing with those social character orientations that dominate personal and public thought, feeling, and acting today. This is all the more true when it comes to humanistic transformation. It is known that in individual character formation, traumatic or repeated negative experiences can impede psychosocial development or even lead to destructive dynamics of development. The formation of social character can also lead to the inhibition or repression or of important human abilities, such as feelings of solidarity and empathy with others, or being able to feel one's own interests or develop one's own fantasies. When such deficits can be observed in many people who generally do not suffer from them, Fromm speaks of socially patterned defects or a pathology of normalcy. They stem from social character formations and are a manifestation of a certain kind of alienation. The emphasis here is on a particular kind, because the socially patterned defects differ from one social character orientation to the other. So a humanistic transformation must focus on the defects and their formative determinants that are typical of a particular social character orientation. For instance, when the marketing character feels pushed from within to be competitive in all relationships. In the following, however, we will focus on two other social character orientations, using the example of the authoritarian character conceived by Fromm himself. It is relatively easy to understand from a historical distance what the socially patterned defects consists of and how a humanistic transformation ought to look. I would like to deal with this only briefly and then turn to a social character that, in addition to the marketing character described by Fromm, increasingly determines private and public thinking, feeling, and acting today. I have analyzed it over the past 20 years with Fromm's method and call it the self-determined, ego-oriented character. In the course of his life, Fromm described in detail a number of social character formations and examined their pathogenic impacts. Fromm did this most extensively for the authoritarian social character and the marketing social character. Other orientations include the hoarding, the necrophilic, the narcissistic, and the productive social character. Let's begin with the authoritarian. Fromm speaks of an authoritarian orientation when the state of being related to others, to oneself, to nature, to work, and so on, is a result of the active or sadistic exercise of dominance and the passive or masochistic exercise of submissiveness, whereby the dominant and the submissive are symbiotically related to each other. The active, sadistic, domination exercising aspect of this character aims to make and keep others submissive and dependent and patronize, exploit, or torture them. If this tendency is directed against oneself, then authoritarians display a high degree of self-control, self-discipline, and feelings of guilt. They then show signs of a rigid superego, which forbids everything pleasurable and frivolously. Typical for the passive masochistic aspect of the authoritarian character are submissiveness and blind obedience to authority and an idealization of the irrational authority. All good things are expected to come from the authority. In dealing with oneself, the masochistic striving expresses itself in a renunciation of everything that is self-willed and self-confident, as well as one's own rights and wishes, and of all expressions of autonomy. The selfless is the ideal of the passive authoritarian. Further, a central feature of Fromm's understanding of authoritarianism, and in this respect Fromm differs totally to Adorno and the whole tradition of Adorno, is that the person exercising authority and the submissive person are symbiotically dependent on and emotionally bound to each other. This symbiosis denotes the psychodynamics of the authoritarian character. The submissive person, under pressure from the ruler, projects his own autonomous powers onto the authority, so that the latter has them at his disposal. However, since the submissive person symbiotically is connected with the authority, he can secondarily participate in his own powers projected onto the authority. In this way, the person exercises dominance and the submissive person are existentially related to each other, and a strong emotional bond is created. The socially patterned defect in authoritarian character manifests itself, on the one hand, in a coexistence and self-experience determined by violence, because authority is not legitimized by competence, but by irrational domination. And on the other hand, in an emotional dependency on each other, in which the autonomous own powers of the human being suffer damage. Everything that could endanger the symbiotic dependence, that is, the striving for independence and self-determination, is to be repressed and will be punished. Foremost, this affects all of one's own powers that could be in competition with authority, namely one's own thoughts, own convictions, own ideas, especially if they question the authority's claim to dominance in business, in politics, in religion, in culture, in society, in state. However, all types of self-determination are dangerous, regardless of whether this refers to family or professional role attributions, religious rituals, the question of gender or sexual preferences, political freedom of expression, or artistic freedoms. Self-determination is understood as a rebellion against the grace, the wisdom, the care, and the superiority of the authority, who always knows better what is good for those dependent on them. The pathogenic effect of an authoritarian character are still familiar, at least to the older among of us. Just think of the extent of violence used in education or by the state and its institutions of authority. Or think of the domination exercised by men due to the combination of authoritarianism and patriarchy. Or think of the fear of punishment or the feelings of guilt that plagued those in the submissive role and that were systematically reproduced by the dominators to keep people dependent. I have sketched the authoritarian character here as a contrast, so to speak, because with historical distance from the authoritarian character, we can more easily recognize the pathogenic effect of this social character. And there is something else we should not forget. With the authoritarian social character, we have an idea that the omnipresent logic of exercising dominance and being submissive was something natural, rational, reasonable, normal for people at that time. And to some extent, this is still the case for people in authoritarian systems today. But this also means that the dominance of a social character orientation ensures that a socially patterned defect is difficult to detect for those affected, because it is the most normal thing in the world for something to tell one where to go and to have one willingly follow. The example of the authoritarian character also indicates how important it is to start with a specific form of alienation and the psychosocial defects of a social character. When considering the question of a humanistic transformation can be specified in terms of content. In the case of the authoritarian character, it must aim at the dissolution of authoritarian dependencies and the strengthening of autonomous own powers. That humanistic transformation means something else altogether for a different social character. I will show in a third section regarding now the ego-oriented character. For about 3 decades now, a new social character has been evident which was already detectable in almost 20% of the adult population in Germany in 2006. I have analyzed it with Fromm's method and called it the ego-oriented character. Above all, ego-oriented people want to be creative in their conscious experience and construct reality in a new and different way, independent of and free from all natural handicaps or social restraints, playfully, so to speak. They are concerned with a freedom that does not want to accept any laws, any nomos. They are not concerned with autonomy, that is, with a self-imposed nomos or law, instead of heteronomy, that is, with restrictions imposed by others, but with a self-determined arbitrary autonomy and a boundless and unbounded freedom, with a freedom that is regardless. In German we have a wonderful word, rücksichtslos. Rücksicht means that I look around me, what happened with the others when I act in this or that way. So in this sense, I understand this way of the ego-oriented to practice freedom in a regardless way. Ego-oriented people want to be connected without experiencing themselves as bound. Its emergence as a social character orientation is due to the achievement of digital technology, networking technology, and electronic media, and the socio-economic conditions that have changed as a result. And maybe also this one should consider if one always argues what the socio-economic conditions. These socio-economic conditions are changed by technical improvements and so on. A great deal of what previously seemed limited by technical, natural and social constraints is suddenly possible. With its fantastic computing, staging and simulation techniques, the digital revolution has opened up unimagined possibilities for creating reality in a new and different way, physically and virtually, and even without limitations and bonds. The new possibilities and requirements lead to one's own inner striving to delimit and to unbound everything. This leads to a new ego construction with other forms of relatedness and other forms of being attached. This ego construction seems egoistic or narcissistic, but psychologically it is a different kind of ego emphasis. The ego wants to be completely self-determined. It's not narcissistic. It's also not egoistic if we understand by egoism that it is to a disadvantage of the other. And that is a traditional term of egoism. But this ego-oriented ego construction grants this aspiration also to everyone else. And that's a very important point. Now, there are two versions of ego orientation, one active and one passive. The active-oriented, ego-oriented person wants to reinvent himself and his environment. his lifestyle and his world of experience and creates his own delimited realities, feelings, and experiences. The passive, ego-oriented person, on the other hand, wants to participate in such newly constructed realities in a self-determined way and chooses the environment, the lifestyle, the brand and music style that suits him or her. The most important trait of the ego-oriented character can only be briefly outlined here. In addition to the already mentioned striving for dissolution of all boundaries, it shows a passion for producing something new, for managing and for controlling, or in the passive version, for experiencing everything that is made, that is staged, and that is simulated. Feelings are important, even if not one's own. Everything gets emotionalized, and the passive, ego-oriented person is attracted to everything emotionalized and wants to sympathize with it. That's a great difference to the marketing orientation, because the marketing orientation is a very cool one. But the ego orientation is a very emotionalized person. In the active version, the ego-oriented person does everything to make himself an experience. And in the passive version, he is particularly receptive of all offers of experience. Ego-oriented character is highly contact-oriented, as long as he does not enter into any obligations as a result. He is also open to everything foreign, different, and innovative, but shows indifference or also intolerance towards all who are not so open and flexible. His hypersensitivity to anything that might limit and bind him also means that negative perceptions of himself or also of others are taboo and replaced, at least in the public sphere, by simulated positive thinking, feeling, and acting. But it's a simulation. The elimination of boundaries and ties by means of digital technology, networking technology, and electronic media in science, research production, in communication, and above all in coping with everyday life is a great blessing. However, striving for the dissolution of boundaries becomes problematic when it comes to the limitation of mental abilities and inner bounds based on one's own psychic structural formations. Such mental reconstruction of personality is also possible today with the help of suggestion and simulation techniques, but it leads to an unbounded self. The reason for this is an increasing deactivation of those own abilities to think, to feel, to judge, to be active from within, and so on, that have been identified as neuronal and psychological prerequisites for human creativity, namely freedom and autonomy. As an example, the deactivation of one's own impulses and emotional powers of relatedness will briefly be mentioned here. Much of what makes us active and creative of our own accord, what intrinsically motivates, animates, and interests us, hardly has a chance to keep up with its thrilling, inspiring, and stimulating effects of staged and virtual experiences, leading to less and less practice of our own mental impulses. As a consequence, one must often first be animated, motivated, inspired, and become interested in order to be able to feel one's own interest, one's own activity, one's own liveliness, provided that no agonizing boredom is to arise. Now, regarding his own feelings, the ego-oriented character finds himself in a dilemma. On the one hand, it is precisely this own feelings that make his limitations and constraints clear to him. So he wants to leave them behind. On the other hand, feelings are something highly individual, alive and vitalizing, and an extremely effective way of self-determining reality, establishing contact and communication, and being connected with others. The ego-oriented character solves this dilemma by going all out for emotion. In doing so, however, he usually does not rely on his own feelings. Instead, he actively enacts or simulates completely different feelings, or passively feels the feelings offered at every turn instead of feeling his own. There is an obvious driving in the ego-oriented social character to replace the practice of creative, cognitive, emotional, and imaginative own powers by applying technical creativity, that is, by means of tools, apps, simulation techniques, algorithms, and artificial intelligence. This, however, leads to a progressive deactivation of our own thinking, feeling, and fantasizing, and an increasing dependence on technical creativity. This is exactly the vision of the pioneers of a life with algorithms and with artificial intelligence. With their big data, they can replace our own thinking, judging, feeling, and wanting with tailor-made solutions and open up new markets for them. And that is capitalism of today. Google advertised its search engine on German television some time ago with the slogan, "Every search will take you further." A young woman beams at a young man, and the text of the search line reads, "How to confess your love." The viewer is assured, every search will take you further. Yes, it is true. Every search takes me further. However, it also is true that it also takes me further away from myself, my own powers, my own creativity. So I become increasingly dependent on outside sources of power. As Fromm has already shown in Escape from Freedom, creativity, independence, and freedom depend on the practice of people's mental own powers, precisely because cognitive, emotional, and imaginative capacities must be practiced to be effective. Their increasing replacement causes them to atrophy as own powers, as the muscles of a leg put in plaster atrophy when they are no longer practiced. Thus, in the ego-oriented character, there is more or less a strong existential dependence on technical creativity. It is therefore with good reasons that creative technology a la Apple is called an iPhone, iPad, iCloud, iTunes, and so on, because they are to be experienced as part of one's own self. One's own thinking, feeling, and acting become that of the technology. At the same time, there is an increased need to control everything and have everything self-determined at one's disposal, which is, I speak of ego orientation, in order not to feel this existential dependence. From a psychodynamic perspective, the striving to determine everything by oneself in an ego-oriented way is an increasingly dominant attempt in our society to avoid the unbearable feeling of powerlessness and accompanies the increasing loss of human creativity and self-efficiency. Whether we do in fact still have access to our creative own powers is relatively easily to find out. You just have to imagine, or better, you even test it in real life. Spending one weekend without electricity and even without battery electricity. So there is no mobile phone, no music, no whodunit TV shows, no WhatsApps, no video, no emails, no calls, no Spotify, no internet, no creative ChatGPT, and so on. If the ceiling does not fall on your head in such a situation, and you still know what to do with yourself and with others, then you are still living from your own physical, cognitive, emotional, and imaginative powers. You experience yourself creatively without being dependent on technical creativity. However, those who are in danger of losing the ground under their feet during such an experiment feel the effects of the socially patterned defect in the ego-oriented character. On the cognitive level, he experiences himself as powerless, disoriented, and perplexed, in a certain way without consciousness. On the affective, emotional level, he experiences himself isolated, alone, cut off, abandoned by all good spirits, without interest and emotional commitment, depressed and listless. On an imaginative level, he experiences himself lacking fantasy, without imagination and ideas of his own. If one understands human creativity, or what Fromm called productive orientation, and humanistic values, not only as an artistic quality, but as the ability to draw from one's own mental powers and to experience oneself as self-effective, then the socially patterned defect in ego orientation can be understood as an increasing loss of human creativity and a mostly unconscious, experienced, threatening factual ego weakness, which ego-oriented people, with their striving for self-determination, can keep in repression as long as they have technical creativity at their disposal. In contrast to the authoritarian orientation, where the pathogenic effects can be recognized more easily from a historical distance, the socially repressed defects in an ego orientation requires crisis experiences to even feel the defects generated by them. In the authoritarian orientation, the sense of one's own autonomous powers is repressed through submissiveness to an irrational authority. In ego orientation, the passion for determining everything by oneself continuously represses the weakness of the ego and the loss of human creativity in thinking, feeling, and imagining. Now, the outlined psychodynamics of alienation in the ego-oriented social character also indicate, from a social psychological perspective, what humanistic transformation means in a world that emphasizes technical solutions and technical creativity everywhere. In principle, as we have seen, the use of technical creativity does not exclude the practice of cognitive, emotional, and imaginative own powers. The prerequisite, however, is that these own powers continue to be practiced. And the ego orientation has a strong striving to replace it. But nevertheless, this is exactly the approach for a humanistic transformation. If we do one thing, we shall do one thing, namely use these fantastic possibilities of digital technology and electronic media, and at the same time specifically activate and practice our mental own powers, so that we can feel ourselves in our human creativity and an authentic self-efficiency. Concerning the physical own powers, muscle power and movement, we noticed relatively quickly, the more we neglect the exercise of these physical own powers, by using the technical means of locomotion, the more important the fitness centers and additional movement become. I cannot yet see a comparable development on broad scale in mental own powers, even though awareness of this is growing among many awake people. And the whole movement of mindfulness is an indication that people get aware of this problem. The same is true for creative abilities of thinking, feeling, and fantasizing. They must be practiced in order to be available. Use it or lose it, the neuroscientist says. However, their fading is not as obviously perceptible as with the physical own powers. Thus, many unresolved questions remain in the room concerning a humanistic transformation with the dominance of the ego-oriented social character. We will even notice that our own capacity to think, feel, fantasize, and judge is fading. Will we even recognize this? What would be the gyms and the mental practices have to look like in order to exercise our own yet modest mental powers? But above all, how would an economy have to be organized that does not want to take away people's own thinking, feeling, and creative design with ChatGPT perfect emotionalizations and tailor-made algorithmic solutions for problematic mental and psychological situations. How can we set limits to the capitalist exploitation of our own mental powers? Even though Fromm's social psychological theory and method were developed many years ago, his concept of social character still seems to be a useful research tool. It enables us to explore how the socio-economic possibilities and requirements of a particular time are represented in the psychic structural formations of many peoples and determine their thinking, feeling, and acting. And at the same time, it does justice to the psychoanalytic insights on a social unconscious and the repressed. I could only hint at what this social psychoanalytic approach means for a humanistic transformation and which insights and strategies result from it. The variety of research presented at this conference so far gives hope that research using Erich Fromm's humanistic and social psychological insight will remain valuable in the future. Thank you very much.